Welcome, and thank you for joining us for our live town hall. I'm Liz Murphy, the former at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and I am delighted to introduce our distinguished historic guests today. Joining us for this town hall will be Second President John Adams, First Lady Abigail Adams, Third President Thomas Jefferson, Fourth President James Madison, and First Lady Dolley Madison. We'll be taking your questions during this town hall. Please email them to JFK President's Day, that's all one word, JFK President's Day @nara.gov. And now, let's begin with our first question for all, this one is for all of our guests today. What did you remember most about living in the White House? President Adams, perhaps we might start with you.
Well, of course, we originally lived in Philadelphia, and what I recall most is that everything of value was taken, and there were no trees on the property. They were cut down, of course, from the time of occupation by British troops. And when we made our move to the new capital, what I remember most vividly was arriving at Washington City and seeing nothing but tree stumps until getting to the president's house and discovering throughout the city that there was a lot more work that needed to be done.
I think perhaps if I can follow on that, John, one of my strongest memories of the presidential mansion in Washington City is the smell of drying plaster and paint. Only a partially finished house for the few months we lived there. I, in fact, hung my laundry in some of the grander rooms that were unfinished. But we were aware we were stewards for a short period of time. And of course, the presidents and first ladies who followed did a great deal of work inhabiting the home and making it a livable and grand place.
Well, I thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Adams, for reminding me that it was a very, very new house, and you all had the honor of being the first occupants in our federal city. I remember most the fact that it was unfinished. But then, of course, as you well know, that gave me a pleasurable opportunity to improve upon it, which I sought to do during the years that I spent there. And I also remember the great number of family that lived in the president's house while I was there. So it was always a very, shall we say, family-filled abode for me, and great hopes and aspirations for what it could be.
And as we took up residence just after you, Mr. Jefferson, I took the opportunity to take what you had made your own and, well, put some touches of my own in it. I worked with Mr. Latrobe, of course, to make it just what I had envisioned along the way.
Would you know, the thing that just came to mind that I recalled were the merino sheep, Mr. Jefferson, that you allowed to graze upon the front lawn of the people's house. Never before had a guard dog sat so diligently. Cerberus itself was undermined by those sheep. But no, indeed, when my wife and I took residence of that home, we endeavored to make it a symbol, not only of the prestige of the presidency, but equally the equity of the American people. And so my happy memories of that home are of our Wednesday night gatherings, people pooling into the salons and parlors to such volume that we needed squeeze in. And in that, the house came to represent a place where we may set aside party, nationality, and in one single instance, enjoy a spirit of conviviality.
Thank you all for those unique perspectives. Our next question is for President Madison. Could you talk about your nickname, Father of the Constitution?
I should be pleased to, but I fear I will sully my humility. There are a great many in our age. We, three gentlemen specifically, who have earned the gray hairs obtained in service of our country. We were children of revolution, and through the course of all of that endeavored to guide America through the difficult epochs that she endured. Now, I will say I find some discomfort being called father of the Constitution, and for several reasons. One, because I was only one of the 55 gentlemen who drafted the document. It is true. The plan of government was my invention. It is true. I attended every day of the Constitutional Convention. And indeed, it is true that the notes left behind for posterity will ensure that the future will always know what debates took place. But government is not like the fabled goddess of wisdom, the work of one mind. It takes many heads and many hands. Our Constitution does not belong to one person, whether they be an architect of it or the president. The Constitution belongs to the American people. And so on the course of that, I find some discomfort at being given all the credit, because if I'm given all the credit, well, I will equally get all the blame.
I know that way very well, Mr. Madison. I, of course, wrote a stirring defense, I would like to think, of the new Constitution while still in England as minister to the Court of St. James. And before that, of course, I was the, dare I say, the father of the Massachusetts Constitution, and wrote thoughts on government during the heady days of independence in the summer of 1776. So much as you did, I drew much of what I wrote from other sources. And of course, need I say, the father of the Declaration of Independence would be Mr. Jefferson, would it not?
Well, I thank you, Mr. Adams, for that recognition. But remember, it was General Washington who referred to our declaration as our promise. And President Washington referred to our Constitution as its guarantee. All of us together were making extraordinary efforts to set firmly in the ground a solid foundation, particularly when the first line of our Constitution is "we the people." And to realize as a child of 14 cannot wear the same clothes at the age of 40, that our government and its laws will grow as we grow as a people.
Thank you for that thoughtful and fascinating exchange. Our next question is for Mrs. Madison. Did President Madison ever express any regret for leaving you alone in the White House with the British on the move?
Thank you for the question. These events have just recently transpired. You speak of the attack in recent months upon our federal city, and it was difficult to meet again that evening. You know, the day before the attack, I chose to stay home. I knew he was off to Maryland, and I also knew that he was to return the next day. And as it turns out, plans can be made, but not always followed along. And as I waited eagerly for his return, I had a meal prepared for those that would be rejoining him in the presidential mansion. And his return never arrived. And we met about midnight that night, finally, after buildings had been set aflame. And we were truly feared we had not survived the evening, each of us. And it was quite a relief to see that we were safe and alive and making new plans for what would be next. And so I think there was no room for regret. There was only room for grateful reunion.
Thank you very much for that perspective. Our next question is from Charles from California for John Adams. How long were you away from home before you were president?
Well, let us begin. I left Braintree February of 1778 to travel to France to aid Dr. Franklin with forming an alliance with the French government, which he, and thanks to the victory at Saratoga, had already been secured. And I would not return until the summer of 1779 in August, in time to draft that Constitution for Massachusetts, only to return in November of that same year. And I would be there without Mrs. Adams until the summer of 1784, when she would join me. And we would be in France, we would be in Holland, and eventually in England, and finally return home in the summer of 1788 together. There were times where the boys joined us and where our eldest, Nabby, joined us as well in those journeys, but not even mentioning Philadelphia. I was away from my family a great deal of the time, and Mrs. Adams will probably have a comment to make at this point. I should think about my always wishing to come home to be a farmer. So it was a great deal of our lives together that we were apart.
The 10 years you spent in Europe altogether, John, were only a small fraction of the time that we spent separated in your service to the country. Of course, as you mentioned, the trips to Philadelphia during the meetings during the beginning of the war, and then, of course, lengthy times when you were serving as vice president and president, when I had terrible spells of illness and was still at home in Massachusetts. So it is a long awaited and well-deserved reward to finally retire to our home in Peacefield.
Thank you both. And Mrs. Adams, our next question is for you. It seems you had strong opinions about Alexander Hamilton. For example, why did you think Alexander Hamilton had the devil in his eye?
Well, a constant schemer, that one, as a man who did not, in fact, hold elected position, but was chosen and wheedled his way into the heart and mind of our first president, General Washington. Hamilton had quite a knack for scheming secretly, pulling strings within the cabinet, which now, my dear man, my husband, John, in an attempt to keep the peace and to keep a steady flow of the government from one president to another, took on many of President Washington's cabinet members, knowing them to be good men and being in a time before strong partisan divides. However, it turns out that Mr. Hamilton was the secret unnamed member of the cabinet, always whispering in their ears, always turning them against him. He tried, in fact, to limit the votes that John would get in his votes for the presidency. He would be an American Bonaparte if he would, a warmonger, and, well, constantly working against the hard work being done by people who had been elected for those positions. So I myself am not quite a fan of Mr. Hamilton. I suppose he may end up deserving what he gets.
I could not agree more, my dear. I was vexed by my men in the executive branch, and little did I know when I inherited them and decided to keep them, that they would take all of their instructions from that little man in New York, that he would go out of his way to say things and write things against my character. What he wrote during the time of the election of 1800 was scandalous, questioning my sanity, questioning my loyalty to American virtue, calling me vain, and all of these things were written for all to read during the time of the election. And he is in retirement now, but perhaps it will not be a long one. We shall see.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from our distinguished guests before our next question?
Well, I would like to comment, Mr. and Mrs. Adams, that I doubt that the two of you were any the less the object and the target of General Hamilton's opinions and vitriol than I certainly was. I wish that both of you could come visit at Monticello, because you would see when you entered the house in the great Indian Hall, there is a bust of myself to your right, and then there is a bust of General Hamilton to the left. And when people enter and are rather startled to see the two of us, if I am present, I say, yes, there the two of us will gaze at one and the other in opposition throughout death, as we have been in life. My point being, that is what we can do in our nation. We can hold opposing opinions in politics and show the rest of the world that a difference of opinion should be a difference of principle. And that principle is to continue to work together and to secure our union. So never forget that General Hamilton and I, though disagreeable with one and the other, could compromise. We did so in New York. We saved our nation there, June 1790, in what I am told is the room where it happened.
Thank you. And President Jefferson, our next question is for you. Our audience member writes, you are a man of many talents. Was one of your interests more important to you than others?
I think the bright star, the North Star of all of my interest is simply curiosity. Curiosity has been my pleasure since I was a young boy. Not even a blade of grass grows uninteresting to me. And when you think as we grow older, so much is to fall about us physically, or sometimes even in mind, it is curiosity that can continue to prove a life force. And so when you think of all of the interests that I have held, I mean not only in horticulture, in farming, in architecture, in books, in politics, in preparation of foods, particularly in the French fashion, in viticulture, everything that can lift the taste of our countrymen is my pleasure to continue to pursue.
Fascinating, thank you. And our next question is for everyone who has kindly joined us today. Could you please speak about peaceful protests and dissent, both while you were in the White House and in general?
Certainly. My first viewing of protests, though many times they were not peaceful, were when I moved my law practice to Boston. And I moved my family as well. And what Mrs. Adams and I saw to Boston on a daily basis, especially when the soldiers were occupying the town. And there seemed to be almost as many soldiers as there were occupants of Boston. They seemed to be everywhere. Magistrates were daily kept busy. And of course, there were protests even before that in Boston regarding the stance. But the protests, once the soldiers arrived, grew even worse, and with the inevitable bloodshed on the night of March 5th of 1770, the Boston Massacre, as my cousin Samuel Adams has called it. And then protests further down were the, dare I say, the peaceful destruction of the tea on Griffin's Wharf in Boston Harbor. The protests that I saw as president had much to do with the undeclared war, the half war, as I call it, against France, their depredations against our shipping, their lack of acknowledgement of the representatives of our government at their capital, despicable indeed. And there was a very grave threat of war against France, and there were many protests against the French government and the French people, which forced us to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts, of which I know Mr. Jefferson is not very happy with.
I will, however, though it might be somewhat of an unpopular opinion, support somewhat of my support for at least the Sedition Act, simply because while it is all right, as you spoke, Mr. Jefferson, of having differing opinions and a strong national culture because of such, the tendency to make absolute falsehoods, to publish them in the press, to spread actual lies about people's characters, those in government, and infect the minds of the people that way. For the average citizen to pick up a newspaper and believe that they are reading what is the truth, but it's really just the scandalous libel of someone who hates someone else in power. I personally think that the things that should be printed ought always to be the truth, and those who print and disseminate untruths ought to be punished, rightfully so.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Adams, for your opinion. We have talked about this many times in person, but you must understand that wherever the press is free, the people will be free. You know, I have said, were it left to me to decide whether we should have this nation with a government and no newspapers, or have this nation with newspapers and no government, I would not hesitate a moment but to accept the latter. It is the people that ought to have the liberty to read the newspaper they choose. It is the people who must continue to have the freedom to make up their own minds for what they read in the newspapers. Now, I agree with you. I am not in favor of twistifications of the facts. However, let the people discern that and let us maintain a free press. I think the fact that all of us, your husband and you and I, can discuss this in a civil fashion is in itself somewhat the element of protest, and is not dissent an act of patriotism, particularly when it is done peaceably. That's the mark of a true democracy.
Well said, Mr. Jefferson. I was going to comment that the very founding of this country is based upon protest, is it not? Protest and dissent. And though I was a child in those years, I perhaps have a unique perspective in that way. I remember all of the grown goings on about me as a child in Virginia. And truth be told, Mr. and Mrs. Adams, Virginia's had quite an opinion upon the protests of those Bostonians of the North. Quite an opinion indeed, because as you said, Mr. Adams, not always in a peaceful manner. And truthfully, in order for your voice to be heard and for change to be made, the question always remains, what must you do to be heard and to be seen in this government? A government that you are trying to change, or a government that you are trying to create? Indeed.
It is well said, all. I will confess, I'm a child of revolution. When the Stamp Act arrived upon American shores, I was 14. However, during my time at the College of New Jersey in Princeton, America was wrestling with the tyrannical legislation which would eventually lead to our Declaration of Independence. We were endeavoring through economic practices to find some reconciliation between ourselves and Great Britain, passing non-importation associations and agreements. Now, in those years, a collection of merchants in New York who violated that agreement and sent a letter to merchants in Philadelphia to do the same. Well, when it arrived in Princeton and Nassau Hall, we, the students at the College of New Jersey, gathered in protest. We hired from our own expenses, well, from our parents' expenses, a local hangman, an executioner, and gathering in the churchyard in our school gowns, burned that association agreement in solidarity and protest. I can recall that was the first that I took part in, and most assuredly not the last. I can think to many instances in the course of my life where I have turned to protest, not in assembly, but rather in writing, to defend certain things in the Commonwealth of Virginia, a religious liberty, Mr. Jefferson and I's nearest and dear cause. In the 1780s, I put forward a memorial and remonstrance, a protest in written form that, over the course of several years, eventually saw religious freedom secured in Virginia. However, we have also witnessed over the course of our life what takes place when protest becomes bloody, when protest becomes acts of open rebellion, like that of Mr. Shays, like the Whiskey Rebellion of the 1790s. We have seen what takes place when a peaceful assembly endeavoring to hold their differences and be heard becomes violent. And upon that very thin line do we, the people of America, walk. Would you know that when I graduated from the College of New Jersey, there was a man who spoke to the president of the college of his students' impropriety. He found himself fatigued by how vocal we were in speaking out against these things in government. He said to John Witherspoon that the students of the College of New Jersey should stick to Latin, to Greek, that their minds cannot soar to the heights needed to contemplate political principles in these uncertain times. Now, John Witherspoon said he was proud of the spirit of liberty cultivated amongst his students and faculty. He said to the gentleman, if he wished to revisit his Latin, he may remember that vigilantibus non dormientibus jura subjuant. The law serves the vigilant, not those who sleep. So I pray that America should ever cultivate a spirit of liberty, that people may be free to speak their minds, that truth may not be in one regime or another, but in the very subtle middle, whereby we must open our minds to discover together.
Thank you very much for that exceptionally thoughtful discussion. Our next question is from Ariana to First Lady Madison and First Lady Adams. Did you ever feel upset about not being allowed to become president or having to really struggle to have your voices heard?
Would you like to speak first, Mrs. Madison, or?
I give the floor to you, my dear.
I fear I may go on quite long. Now, I was very, very fortunate, of course, to have a husband, a partner in life who very seriously and dearly took my own words, my opinions to heart. And I should like to say, though some would, of course, say it was perhaps a negative aspect of his presidency, that the opinions of a representative of the gentler sex may have contributed to some of your own beliefs, some of your own policies put into place. Now, I myself would never have wished to be in a seat of power, nor would I say that my good husband wished to be in a seat of power either. It seemed that every step of the way in John's political career, it was more of a filling an empty spot out of necessity. When his nation called upon him to serve, he occasionally begrudgingly took up the call and did so fully. Neither of us ever having any yearning for personal power, but I would say it would be good if there were more opinions of women and of those perhaps not so often represented in the highest office, that would be included in discourse, in lawmaking, in executive power, because a wider range of opinions and viewpoints ultimately leads to a better, more informed, diverse, and stronger democracy.
Well said, Mrs. Adams. I couldn't agree more. And indeed, I have been called presidentess, you know, and though that is a title that I don't bestow upon myself, I can understand why I have been called such. And there is a curious power that we do have. Is that not true, Mrs. Adams? Some ability to lead through our husbands. And though I cannot also say that I should like to have had the seat of power myself, I do feel as though I have had the ability, the great ability to influence decisions that have been made throughout our term in the seat of office. And our term, I say. And there were times when my husband was sick, not so long ago, indeed, where I took up the writing of letters for him, the making of state decisions when we were, he was unable rather to even get out of bed and make some of those decisions. Of course, I consulted him along the way, but there are small ways in which I have felt the bit of power of this seat of office. And I agree that the voices of women should be heard and should be present, but I cannot say that I should ever like the position myself. But there have been talk, you know, of many years, like even as a child, I remember a discussion of ladies, property holding ladies holding a vote even. Should they be femme sole, keeper of their own property, that they should indeed hold the vote. And I suppose that could be a way to infuse the voice of a lady in particular. Indeed.
May I just say that my greatest difficulties as vice president and then as president were times when Mrs. Adams was not by my side.
I thank you both, and thank you, President Adams, as well. We have time for just one more question in this session. President Madison, may we direct it to you? And again, I do regret that time is running short. What was your most important decision during the Revolutionary War?
Well, I should say, during our war for independence, I found myself affixed in a political role. At the age of 25, I was called by the Commonwealth of Virginia to sit and decide upon Virginia's stance of independency. Now, my two worthy contemporaries were occupied in Philadelphia, their quills itching to discover what should the stance upon independence be. Now, in the Second Continental Congress, we had these various states awaiting for instructions by their provincial governments. Rhode Island voted for independence solely for itself. North Carolina put forward that if independency were to be introduced, they would vote in favor of it. But all eyes looked to Virginia. Virginia, which was the largest, the wealthiest, the best of these former colonies. And so, in 1776, in the spring of that year, I gathered in the old Capitol in the city of Williamsburg, and on the 15th day of May, unanimously down the rolls, the stance for independency was called. And upon that, I put my name in the affirmative of that vote. An I for independency. It was this resolution that made its way to Philadelphia City. It was this resolution that allowed pen to go to paper and put forward the immortal words, well, ushered by my dearest friend, Thomas Jefferson. I will say that was, in many regards, my only legislative action because I lost the election of 1777 horribly.
Thank you so much, and thank you, President Madison. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and thanks to you, our viewers, for joining us. Please join us again at 1:10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our historic guests to answer more questions from you and other viewers like you. Remember that you can rewatch your favorites or catch anything else you missed today on our website. Thank you again.